Did you know that modern technology is actively rewiring your brain to destroy your ability to focus? Thanks to infinite scrolling and constant dopamine hijacking, the average human attention span has degraded to less than 8 seconds, leaving our minds trapped in a state of chronic anxiety and mental fatigue. But there is an ancient, highly sophisticated neurological circuit breaker engineered to rebuild your brain's prefrontal cortex, and it's called Kushu. Today on The Missing Dots, we are bypassing superficial platitudes to show you the cutting-edge neuroscience, brain imaging data, and clinical mechanics of what actually happens to your brain networks during deep, absolute focus and prayer.
It really is just an incredible intersection, of human biology and a practice that goes back, well, 1,400 years.
It really is. And to start things off today, I want to set a very specific scene for you listening right now. Imagine we're just sitting in the courtyard of an old mosque. The prayer finished maybe 10 or 15 minutes ago. The air is cool, the architecture around us has stood for centuries, and there's this heavy, profound stillness.
Yeah, that kind of quiet you can actually feel settling into your bones.
Exactly. But then, you reach into your pocket and you feel the sharp buzz of your phone.
Yeah.
And instantly, almost violently, that peace just shatters. Your mind is pulled right back into the chaos.
It happens so fast, too.
Right. I was going through all the research we have today, these functional MRI scans, clinical neuropsychology papers, and classical texts, and I'm just sitting here in absolute awe.
It's fascinating.
We are looking at a tradition that maps so perfectly onto the exact cognitive deficits that modern humans are suffering from right now. And it genuinely makes me wonder about our daily experience. Like, are we just temporarily distracted by all these screens? Or are we actually structurally damaged at a biological level?
That's the core question we have to face, honestly. And, well, the clinical research points heavily towards structural damage. It's not just a passing lapse in concentration, like, when you forget where you put your keys.
No.
The actual physical infrastructure of how we process the world is shifting. You mentioned the 8-second attention span in the intro. That comes from a widely cited Microsoft study showing the human attention span has dropped below that of a goldfish.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is. Now, whether you take that specific number as a metaphor or like a strict scientific metric, the underlying reality is heavily documented in neuroimaging studies. The sustained attention networks in the brain are physically weakening across populations that consume high amounts of digital media.
So it isn't just a feeling of being scattered or overwhelmed. Our actual brain anatomy is changing because of this.
Exactly. I mean, the brain is entirely plastic. It operates on a strict use-it-or-lose-it economy. When scientists look at the brains of heavy social media users using functional MRI and diffusion tensor imaging, they don't just see a change in activity, they see measurable reductions in gray matter density. Specifically, the thinning happens in the prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to be exact.
And what does that specific area do? Like, what are we losing?
That is the area responsible for your executive function. It's the part of you that holds a thought, inhibits an impulse, plans for the future, and regulates your emotional reactions.
So it's basically the adult in the room of your mind.
That's a perfect way to put it. And while that area is physically thinning out, the amygdala, which is the primitive fear and threat detection center of the brain, is showing measurable increases in volume and reactivity.
Wow. That explains so much about how everyday life feels right now. You pick up the phone without even making a conscious decision to do it. You just find it in your hand.
Yeah, totally automated.
And there's this constant hum of low-grade panic. I hear people talk about this all the time, this ambient anxiety that you're missing something or that a threat is right around the corner. You just can't settle down. What is driving that specific feeling in the brain?
It really comes down to a mechanism called the digital dopamine loop. To understand this, you have to look at how our evolutionary reward system was designed. Dopamine is often called the pleasure chemical, but that's actually, well, it's a bit of a misconception.
Really? I feel like everyone just assumes dopamine equals happiness.
Right, but dopamine is actually the chemical of motivation and seeking. It's designed to drive us toward things that keep us alive, like finding food or forming social bonds. And it operates on a prediction error mechanism.
What does that mean, prediction error?
It means dopamine spikes highest not when you actually get a reward, but when you anticipate a reward, especially if the schedule of that reward is entirely unpredictable.
Okay, wait. So the chemical reward is higher when I don't know what's coming compared to when I actually get the thing I want.
Exactly. Think of a fisherman casting a net. If he knows exactly how many fish he will catch every single time, it just becomes a chore.
Right, it's predictable.
But if he doesn't know if this cast might bring up nothing and the next cast might bring up a massive haul, his brain is flooded with dopamine. It keeps him hooked on the activity of casting. Social media platforms engineer their apps around this exact neurobiology. The infinite scroll uses variable ratio reinforcement.
So every time I swipe up on my screen, my brain treats it like casting a net into the dark.
Right. You don't know if the next video will be boring or something that makes you angry or something incredibly funny. Your brain is constantly primed, constantly anticipating the unknown.
And that just floods the system.
It floods your nervous system with dopamine. But your body craves homeostasis, right? So if you flood it with dopamine constantly, your brain protects itself by desensitizing your dopamine receptors. It literally shuts down the receptors so it doesn't get overwhelmed.
And then what happens? You just feel numb.
Yes. You start needing more and more extreme stimulation just to feel a baseline level of normal. And because your brain is always frantically looking for the next quick hit to satisfy that craving, it stops investing any metabolic energy into the networks required for deep, sustained, quiet focus.
So the adult in the room goes to sleep.
Exactly. The adult goes to sleep, and the primitive, seeking part of the brain takes over the steering wheel.
Which leaves us completely trapped inside our own heads, unable to sit quietly in a room for 5 minutes. And the research refers to a very specific network in the brain that gets hijacked when this happens, right? The default mode network. I've seen this term popping up a lot.
Yes, the default mode network, or the DMN. It's a really fascinating piece of our neurology. Think of the DMN as the brain's idling mode.
Like a car in neutral.
Right. When you aren't actively focusing your attention on an external task, like reading a complex document or having a deep conversation or fixing a car, your brain defaults to this specific network.
So it's what happens when my mind wanders.
Exactly. And in a healthy person, the DMN is incredibly useful. It allows for creative daydreaming, reflecting on your past experiences, and imagining future scenarios so you can prepare for them. It's a necessary function for human survival and creativity.
But I'm guessing something goes very wrong with it today.
Terribly wrong.
Yeah.
Because of the constant erratic digital overstimulation we just talked about, the DMN gets trapped in a hyperactive state. It loses its natural inhibition.
Oh, wow. So it just runs wild.
Yes. So instead of pleasant daydreaming or constructive reflection, a hyperactive DMN starts generating aggressive, intrusive loops. It traps you in cycles of social comparison, intense anxiety about the future, and dark, depressive rumination about the past.
It's like a car engine revving in neutral with a brick pressed down on the gas pedal. It's burning fuel, making a ton of noise and tearing itself apart, but you aren't actually going anywhere.
That's a perfect way to visualize it. You completely lose the ability to just be present in your environment. The brain cannot switch off the internal noise. Modern clinical neuroscience recognizes this exact DMN hyperactivation as a core defining feature in clinical depression, generalized anxiety disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder.
SubhanAllah, this is where reading the classical text just blew my mind, because when you read the early Islamic scholars, they were talking about the exact same pathology. They didn't have functional MRI machines, but they recognized the exact symptom profile.
They absolutely did.
They called it al-waswasa.
It's the inner whispering.
Right. The intrusive, circling, chaotic inner whispering. And what's amazing is that they didn't just write it off as some generic spiritual failing or a lack of faith. They treated it as a distinct psychological affliction.
Yeah, they approached it very systematically.
I was reading about this 9th century polymath, Abu Zaid al-Balkhi. He wrote extensively on the hygiene of the soul and the body. Centuries before modern cognitive behavioral therapy even existed, he identified this exact chaotic inner whispering as a pathology.
It's incredible how far ahead of his time he was.
He saw that the human mind could get stuck in an unhealthy loop of anxiety and rumination, and he prescribed structured cognitive interventions to break it. He explicitly recognized that you couldn't just wish it away or feel guilty about it.
Yeah.
You had to actively disrupt the cycle.
Al-Balkhi's work is incredibly prescient when you look at it through the lens of modern neuropsychology. He intuitively understood what we now call the conflict between the default mode network and the central executive network. If your brain is stuck in that hyperactive, rutting DMN loop, you can't simply think your way out of it.
Why not? Like, if I realize I'm overthinking, why can't I just tell my brain to stop?
Because the very tool you would normally use to think clearly and direct your attention is what's currently damaged or suppressed. Your executive function is offline while the DMN is running wild.
Oh, I see.
It's like trying to put out a fire using a hose that's already melted. You need a mechanism to forcefully interrupt that loop from the outside in. You need a circuit breaker.
And that brings us to the real core of this conversation. The circuit breaker we're talking about today is Salah, the Islamic ritual prayer, specifically when it's performed with a quality called khushu. Now, anyone familiar with the Islamic tradition hears the word khushu constantly.
Right, it's a very common term.
It's usually translated softly as humility, concentration, or reverence. But looking at the clinical mechanics and the neurobiology, it is so much more than just a warm, emotional feeling in your chest, isn't it?
It's entirely different from a vague emotional state. In rigorous neurological terms, khushu is the deliberate maximal activation of the central executive network, the CEN, and the absolute forceful suppression of the default mode network.
So it's an active takeover.
Yes, it is a state of profound top-down cognitive mastery. You are taking the steering wheel back. And what is so deeply fascinating is how the physical and vocal structure of the prayer systematically engineers this exact brain state from the ground up.
Let's walk through the mechanics of that step by step because the sequencing of the prayer is brilliant. It starts before you even move your body with the naya, the intention. And then you have the takbir where you raise your hands to your ears and say Allahu Akbar, which means God is the greatest. I always just knew this as the standard starting motion of prayer. But neurobiologically, what is actually happening in the brain in that specific moment?
The takbir functions as what cognitive scientists call an executive cognitive command. When you physically raise your hands to your ears and vocalize that phrase out loud, you are creating a highly salient, self-generated boundary marker in your working memory. It signals a total paradigm shift to your nervous system.
Like a director clapping a slateboard before a movie scene begins. Action.
Exactly. And the naya, the conscious internal intention that you formulate just seconds before you raise your hands, acts as a task set reconfiguration.
How does that work?
Think of your brain's working memory as an orchestra warming up. You have the violins practicing a piece from your job, the cellos worrying about family stress, the horns thinking about an argument you had on social media. It's a mess of conflicting noise.
Right, that's just normal modern life.
The naya is the cognitive equivalent of the conductor stepping up to the podium and tapping his baton. It's a command that tells the entire orchestra to stop the random noise, clear the current working memory cache, and dedicate all processing power to a single, unified new symphony.
That makes total sense, because if you don't explicitly command your brain to switch tasks, it just keeps running all those old anxieties in the background.
Right.
The background apps drain the battery.
Perfectly said.
So you make the intention, you raise your hands, you say the words, and the slate is wiped clean.
Yeah.
Now you're standing there. And there is a very specific instruction from the Prophet Muhammad about exactly where you are supposed to look. You are instructed to fix your gaze firmly on the exact spot where your forehead will eventually touch the ground in prostration. It's called the Madis al-Sujood.
Right.
I have to ask, why is that visual restriction so intensely important? Why can't I just look straight ahead or look around the room?
Because of how our visual processing system is wired.
Sure.
The visual cortex takes up a massive amount of real estate in the human brain. It is incredibly resource heavy. And our eyes naturally perform what neurobiologists call visual saccades.
Visual saccades, what are those?
They are incredibly rapid, involuntary eye movements. Even when you think you are staring at something, your eyes are making these micro movements darting around.
Just get in the room.
Exactly. Evolutionarily, we are wired to constantly scan our environment for movement, looking for a hidden predator or a food source. Every single time your eye darts to a new stimulus, a shadow on the wall, a person walking by, a pattern on the carpet, it sends an electrical signal to the thalamus, which then interrupts the cortex to say, process this new information.
It's like a security guard who refuses to let you work because he keeps tapping you on the shoulder to show you the security camera feeds. Look at this. Look at that.
Right. And every one of those tiny visual interruptions feeds the default mode network. It keeps the brain locked in a state of high vigilance, novelty seeking, and cognitive noise.
Wow.
By intentionally freezing those saccades and staring at one single unchanging, uninteresting spot on the ground, you initiate a biological process called thalamic sensory gating.
Thalamic sensory gating. Break that down for me. You're physically starving the brain of new distractions.
You are. The thalamus acts as the gatekeeper, or the bouncer, of sensory information entering your brain. When you forcefully freeze your gaze on a static point, The thalamus eventually realizes there is no new visual threat or novelty coming in from the environment.
So it just stops checking.
So the bouncer stops letting peripheral visual data into the VIP section of your cortex. It essentially turns down the volume on the outside visual world. And when the brain isn't spending massive amounts of metabolic energy processing visual noise, it allows the prefrontal cortex to channel all that saved energy inward into the cognitive task of the prayer.
Wait, let me challenge this for a second. If I'm just staring at a blank spot on the floor and starving my brain of visual data, isn't that just sensory deprivation?
It's a fair question.
How is that any different from just zoning out while staring at a blank wall? I do that all the time when I'm bored, and my mind usually wanders more, not less.
That's a great distinction. When you zone out while staring at a wall, your visual system relaxes, but your executive function is turned off. Your brain just hands the keys over to the default mode network, and you start daydreaming. That's passive zoning out.
Right.
Kushu is an active, highly localized focus. You are freezing the visual input, but you are keeping the executive function wide awake through the next step of the prayer, which is the recitation. You are shutting down the perimeter monitors, but you are putting all the guards in the central vault.
Ah, okay.
Hey.
That makes sense. The body is still, the eyes are locked, the outside visual noise is gated out. Then comes the recitation, the Qur'an. You are reciting the Quran out loud, following very specific rhythmic and phonetic rules, the tajweed.
Yes.
What does the act of vocalizing these specific words do to the brain state we just established?
It creates a rhythmic auditory motor loop. First, you are engaging the motor cortex to physically shape your mouth and vocal cords to speak the Arabic words. While you do that, you are simultaneously monitoring the sound of your own voice through your auditory cortex to ensure you are pronouncing it correctly. That alone stabilizes the brain. But because you are reciting verses from the Quran, you are also engaging the semantic network to process and understand the profound meaning of the words you are saying.
So I'm not just making a soothing, humming sound or chanting a meaningless syllable. I'm actively processing deep theological meaning.
Exactly. And the neuroimaging data on this kind of activity is striking. Sustained rhythmic recitation coupled with semantic meaning shifts the brain's electrical activity.
In what way?
It pulls you away from high-stress beta waves, which are the rapid, jagged brain waves associated with panic, scattered thinking, and modern digital anxiety. Instead, it begins coupling theta and gamma brain waves.
Theta and gamma. I know alpha waves are usually associated with relaxation, but what does theta and gamma do?
Theta waves are slow, powerful waves associated with deep, calm, internal focus and memory consolidation. You usually only see them right before you fall asleep or in states of deep meditation.
Oh, wow. And gamma.
Gamma waves, on the other hand, are the fastest brain waves. They are the signature of high-level cognitive integration, intense awareness, and sudden insight. When you couple them together, you get a highly unique state of consciousness. You are profoundly physically calm, but you are intensely, sharply awake.
This sounds exactly like what the great classical scholar Al-Ghazali was describing way back in the 11th century. I was reading his chapter on the secrets of prayer, and he wrote extensively about this concept called Hudur al-Qalb, which translates to the presence of the heart.
A very central concept.
He insisted that true prayer required this intense internal presence, and that just going through the physical motions without it was like presenting a dead body to a king. Reading his work through a modern lens, it seems to me he was describing exactly what cognitive scientists call meta-awareness.
Al-Ghazali's framework mirrors modern cognitive neuroscience almost perfectly. He understood that the human mind, even in prayer, would naturally try to drift back to worldly concerns. He didn't expect perfection, he expected active management.
Active management. I like that phrase.
Meta-awareness is essentially the act of monitoring your own attention. It's the ability to step back and realize, hey, I'm no longer focusing on what I'm doing.
And where does that happen in the brain?
It's governed by a region called the anterior cingulate cortex. It's basically the brain's error detection system. When you are in prayer, reciting a verse, and you suddenly realize you are thinking about an argument you had at work or what you're going to have for lunch.
Which happens to all of us.
Right. That moment of realization is your anterior cingulate cortex catching an attentional error.
So the distraction itself isn't the failure.
Exactly. The practice of Kushu is the practice of gently but firmly pulling the attention back to the recitation the moment you notice it wandering. Every single time your mind wanders and you catch it and pull it back to the meaning of the words, you are physically strengthening the neural pathways of your executive control.
Oh, wow.
You are actively pruning the hyperactive DMN and fortifying the CEN.
I love that. So even a distracted prayer, if you keep fighting to pull your focus back, is deeply productive for the brain. But I want to push back on something here because this is a question that always comes up for me.
Sure, go ahead.
If the ultimate goal is this internal cognitive presence, if it's all about brain waves and executive function, why do we need all the physical choreography? The standing, the bowing, the prostrating on the floor.
It's a lot of movement.
Right. If the goal is internal stillness,
Right.
why not just sit completely still on a comfortable cushion with your eyes closed the way you see in a lot of other meditation practices? Why force the body to move so much?
It's a critical question, and it really highlights the unique genius of the specific protocol. The answer lies in the physiological reality that the mind almost always follows the body. To truly quiet a human mind, especially a mind that is severely damaged by modern chronic hyperstimulation, you usually require a profound, undeniable physiological shift. The physical postures of Salah aren't just arbitrary ceremonial choreography. They are heavily engineered somatic anchors. They force a rapid change in your autonomic nervous system.
Okay, let's trace that physical shift then. In the prayer, you transition from standing straight up to bowing with your hands on your knees, which is called the ruku, and then you go all the way down to the ground into sujood, the prostration.
Yes.
In that posture, your forehead, your nose, your palms, your knees, and your toes are all firmly touching the earth. What is actually happening in the human body the moment you hit the ground?
The transition into sujood is arguably the most neurologically and physiologically potent moment of the entire protocol. Let's look at it through a few different lenses. First, let's look at the hemodynamics, the flow of blood.
Okay.
By physically placing your head below the level of your heart, you are utilizing gravity to force a measurable, significant surge of blood flow directly into the frontal lobes of the brain.
You are literally flooding the exact part of the brain that we just said gets exhausted by digital scrolling.
Yes. Your prefrontal cortex requires massive amounts of glucose and oxygen to maintain that deep state of concentration. By going into prostration, you are delivering a sudden mechanical surge of fresh, oxygenated blood right to the tissue that needs it most.
That is fascinating.
But it's not just about blood flow, it's the profound effect on the autonomic nervous system.
Break that down for me. How does the posture change the nervous system?
When you fold your body into the prostration posture, you are physically compressing your abdominal cavity against your thighs. This physical compression, combined with the specific alignment of your neck and spine, stimulates the baroreceptors, which detect blood pressure changes, and heavily engages the vagus nerve.
I hear the vagus nerve talked about all the time in wellness circles now. It's the major nerve connecting the brain to the body's organs, right?
Correct. It wanders from the brainstem all the way down through the chest and abdomen. And specifically, the posture of prostration activates what we call the ventral vagal complex.
And what does that do?
In modern polyvagal theory, this is the system that governs social engagement, calming, and feelings of absolute physical safety. Think about the posture of sujood. You are completely exposed. You cannot see what's behind you. You cannot easily run away. Your head is on the floor.
You're completely vulnerable.
Yes. When you hold that specific posture with all those contact points on the ground, your body is sending a massive, undeniable physical signal up the vagus nerve to the primitive brainstem.
And what is that signal saying?
It's saying, I am safe, I am completely surrendered. There is no immediate physical threat in my environment. When the brainstem receives that signal, it immediately suppresses the fight-or-flight response of the amygdala. It turns off the adrenaline and cortisol drip.
It's a biological override button. You're using your physical body to tell your nervous system to stand down, even if your mind was panicking a minute ago.
Exactly. You are forcing the biology of peace. And this brings us to why the classical Islamic requirement of tumanina is so vital.
Tumanina.
Yes, tumanina translates to physical tranquility or absolute stillness in each posture. Islamic jurisprudence dictates that if you do not pause and achieve total physical stillness in a posture before moving to the next one, the prayer is technically invalid.
That's a huge point. It's not just a soft recommendation for a better spiritual experience. It is a strict legal requirement of the prayer itself.
Yes, and neurologically, it is an absolute prerequisite for the state we're talking about. A trembling, hurried, agitated body simply cannot produce a still mind. The physical stillness is what anchors the wandering mind.
So if you're rushing,
If you rush through the prostration, if you hit the floor and bounce right back up like a spring, you abort the intervention before it can work. You stand back up before the blood flow can adequately perfuse the prefrontal cortex, and before the vagus nerve has time to signal safety to the brainstem.
Alhamdulillah, I have to say, this is such a massive aha moment for me. Because everyone listening to this knows that exact feeling. You're running late, you're stressed about a meeting, and you rush through the prayer at lightning speed just to check it off your to-do list.
We've all been there.
And you walk away from the prayer mat feeling completely hollow and unfulfilled. Your mind is just as chaotic, if not more chaotic, than when you started. And now I understand why. It's because you literally deprived your frontal lobes of that vascular reset. You didn't stay down long enough for the biology to do its work.
You went through the superficial physical motions, but you interrupted the neurological intervention before it could take effect. The body was there, but the physiological switch was never flipped.
So this brings up a challenge that I see everywhere today, especially in our hyper-secularized wellness culture. Let's call it the secular equivalency challenge. People will listen to everything we just discussed, the vagus nerve stimulation, the DMN suppression, the blood flow to the frontal lobes, the theta waves, and they'll say, well, that is all fantastic science. But I can get all of that from a secular mindfulness app on my phone, or I can go to a local yoga class, or I can just sit on my couch and do deep breathing exercises for 10 minutes. Why do I need the specific Islamic framework of Salah at all?
It's probably the most common modern critique of ritual practice. And the answer lies in the fundamental difference between single-channel interventions and what neuroscience refers to as multisensory enhancement. Secular mindfulness practices are highly effective, and there is great data behind them, but they are almost always single-channel.
What does single channel mean in this context?
It means they isolate one single sensory pathway. You sit still and focus exclusively on the feeling of air moving in and out of your nose. Or you put on headphones and listen to a guided voice. Or in a physical yoga class, you focus primarily on somatic stretching and balance.
You are dialing into just one input.
Right. Sala, on the other hand, is a highly complex multimodal protocol. It combines vestibular changes because your inner ear is shifting as you move up and down. It combines proprioceptive feedback from the pressure on your joints. It utilizes visual gating from the fixed gaze on the floor. It involves auditory feedback from hearing your own voice. It demands semantic processing from translating the Arabic meanings. And crucially, it involves a relational cognitive orientation.
Wow, that is a lot happening at once.
It is. When you stimulate multiple sensory and cognitive channels simultaneously toward a single unified focus, the brain responds with multisensory enhancement.
Meaning the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Exactly. The overall neurological activation and the depth of the DMN suppression exceed what you would get from doing those things individually. It is a far more robust systemic intervention.
That makes a lot of sense from a physical and sensory perspective. But you mentioned something in that list that I want to explore further. You mentioned a relational cognitive orientation. What does that actually mean, and why is it important neurologically?
This is the theological vector of the practice, and it engages an entirely different, incredibly complex part of the brain. When you practice secular mindfulness, the orientation is inherently inward. It is self-referential. You are observing your own passing thoughts, your own breathing, your own body sensations. It's just you and you.
Right.
When you practice Salah, the orientation is entirely relational and directed outward.
Because you are addressing a creator.
Yes. You are consciously standing before an actively perceiving, listening creator. The Prophet Muhammad defined the highest possible state of spiritual excellence, known as ihsan, as worshiping God as though you can actually see him and knowing that even if you do not see him, he absolutely sees you.
That's a profound shift in perspective.
It's a massive cognitive shift, and this specific awareness, the active belief that you are interacting with another mind, a divine mind that knows your deepest intentions, activates the brain's mentalizing network.
The mentalizing network. What parts of the brain are involved in that?
It includes areas like the temporoparietal junction and the superior temporal sulcus. These are the highly evolved networks we use to process complex social relationships, empathy, and theory of mind. The ability to understand that someone else has thoughts and feelings.
Oh, wow.
Purely inward, secular meditation does not engage the mentalizing network in the same profound way because there is no other to relate to.
So you aren't just trying to empty your mind into a void. You are actively directing your mind toward a relationship.
Precisely. You are replacing the chaotic, anxious noise of the ego with the profound awe of the divine. You're stepping out of yourself. And then there's the crucial matter of dosage.
Right. The prescription of praying 5 times a day.
Yes. The timing of the 5 daily prayers is not arbitrary. If you map the mandated prayer times against human biology, they align remarkably well with the natural inflection points of our circadian rhythms and the peaks and troughs of cortisol production throughout the day.
I never thought about that connection to circadian rhythms.
It's brilliant, really. By forcing a complete hard stop from worldly tasks at these specific intervals, dawn, midday, afternoon, sunset, and night, you prevent the default mode network from regaining pathological dominance. You are regularly pruning back the stress response before it has a chance to overwhelm the system.
Okay, I see the brilliance in the timing, but I have to push back here, and this is a genuine concern I have. What about the repetition itself? You are doing the exact same physical movements, reciting the exact same core phrases 5 times a day, every single day, for your entire adult life. Doesn't that inevitably just become a dead, automated habit?
It's a real concern.
I mean, think about driving a car. When you first learn, it takes all your focus. But after 10 years, you drive all the way home from work, and you don't even remember the drive. Your brain just checks out. Doesn't the brain do the exact same thing with repetitive prayer?
That is a very real, very dangerous risk, and cognitive scientists actually have a term for it. It's known as the basal ganglia trap.
The basal ganglia trap.
Yes. The basal ganglia is a structure deep in the brain that governs automated habits. When any behavior becomes so highly repetitive that it no longer requires conscious effort or novelty to execute, the brain, seeking to save metabolic energy, offloads the processing of that behavior from the highly demanding prefrontal cortex down into the automated basal ganglia.
So it puts it on autopilot to save energy.
Exactly. If that happens to your prayer, you completely lose the neurocognitive benefit we've been discussing. You are just driving on autopilot. The body is moving, but the executive function is asleep.
So if human biology naturally tries to automate repetitive tasks, how does the Islamic system prevent the prayer from falling into the basal ganglia trap?
The tradition aggressively guards against this through two primary mechanisms: tafahum and the constantly renewed niyyah. Tafahum is the active, strenuous effort to comprehend the specific meaning of the verses being recited.
So you have to really engage with the text.
Yes. While the core of the prayer involves repeating the opening chapter, the Fatiha, you are also supposed to recite different verses from the Quran in the subsequent parts of the prayer. By focusing on the changing semantic meaning of different verses, you force the prefrontal cortex to stay online and actively process information.
It breaks the predictability.
Exactly. And the niyya, the conscious, deliberate intention required before every single prayer, forces you to manually re-engage your executive function before you even start.
Oh, so you can't just slide into it unconsciously.
Right. When you actively monitor your presence, when you strive for that state of khushu rather than just mindless compliance, the repetition actually acts as a strength training protocol. It builds profound cognitive flexibility and resilience rather than rigid automatization.
Okay, so let's take this a step further into the philosophical realm because we have to address the materialist threat. You and I have just spent a significant amount of time explaining the spiritual state of khushu using terms like prefrontal blood flow, DMN suppression, theta-gamma coupling, and vagal tone.
Ew.
A strict materialist or a militant atheist is going to listen to this conversation and say, aha, you just proved my entire point. Your so-called spiritual experience is nothing but a localized change in brain chemistry. It's just a biological illusion created by blood pressure and oxygen. How do we reconcile the physical, measurable science with the reality of an immaterial soul?
The materialist argument is common, but it relies on a fundamental category error in logic. They assume that by meticulously describing the biological mechanism of an experience, they have somehow explained away the objective reality of the experience itself.
Can you give me an analogy to understand that flaw in logic?
Yes. Think about the famous experiments with the so-called God helmet. This was a device developed by neuroscientists that used transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, to apply weak magnetic fields to the temporal lobes of the brain. Or consider the resurgence in the use of psychedelic compounds like psilocybin. It is entirely true that applying targeted magnets to the brain or ingesting certain potent chemicals can artificially induce intense feelings of oneness, ego dissolution, or a sensed presence in the room.
Right.
The materialist looks at that and says, look, I can trigger a mystical experience with a magnet or a pill in a lab. Therefore, God is just a glitch in the temporal lobe.
Right. That's exactly the argument you hear on every debate stage. We can recreate it so it's fake.
But that relies on confusing the instrument with the source. This is often called the transducer versus generator argument. Let's use a different analogy. Think of a beautiful stained glass window in a cathedral.
Okay.
The sunlight passes through the glass and creates a magnificent pattern of colors on the stone floor. If someone comes along and cracks the glass or changes the color of a pane, the pattern of light on the floor becomes distorted or changes color.
Because the medium through which the light travels has changed.
Precisely. Now imagine a person looking at the floor and saying, aha, because I can change the pattern on the floor by altering the glass, that proves the sun outside doesn't exist. The glass is generating the light.
That's absurd.
It is. The glass is just the necessary medium for the light to enter the room. In the same way, the brain is the highly sophisticated, necessary biological interface for human consciousness to operate within a material universe. Finding the neural correlate of an experience does not mean the object of that experience is an illusion.
So when I look at a tree, my brain processes it.
Exactly. When you look at an oak tree, your occipital lobe lights up. A neuroscientist can map exactly how your brain processes the photons bouncing off the leaves. But mapping the visual cortex doesn't mean the oak tree is an illusion existing only inside your head. The tree is real.
Your brain is just processing it.
The changes in the brain during prayer are simply the physical footprint of a genuine spiritual encounter.
That completely flips the materialist argument on its head. But it does raise a question about those artificial experiences. If you can feel a sense of oneness from a psychedelic drug, why do the hard work of prayer?
This is where we must draw a very sharp clinical contrast between artificial states and genuine khushu. The classical Islamic scholars were highly aware of altered states of consciousness, and they differentiated clearly between sakra, which translates to intoxication, and kash, which is genuine spiritual unveiling or clarity.
What is the neurological difference between intoxication and unveiling?
Psychedelics, or intense magnetic stimulation, create a chaotic, bottom-up flooding of the nervous system. They violently disrupt normal neural networks, leading to a transient, entirely passive, and often disorienting state of intoxication.
So you're just along for the ride.
You are essentially hacking the hardware, forcing the system to overheat and crosswire. Khushu, on the other hand, is a highly ordered, top-down cognitive mastery.
Top-down meaning it originates from your conscious will.
Yes. It is carefully cultivated through years of discipline, moral effort, and sustained, sober attention. A person in khushu maintains sharp analytical clarity and total motor control over their body while simultaneously achieving deep transcendent peace. The source of the experience matters entirely to the outcome.
It is so incredibly strange to me how modern society operates in this regard. You have so many people today who will entirely trust a profound feeling of cosmic oneness if it is induced by swallowing a synthetic compound in a clinical laboratory setting or at a retreat in the jungle. But those same people remain deeply, cynically skeptical of a feeling of profound peace that is carefully cultivated through decades of disciplined, sober worship, community service, and moral accountability.
It reflects a very modern consumer desire. People want the neurochemical reward of spirituality, the dopamine and serotonin rush of feeling connected to the universe, but they want it instantly without any of the ethical, behavioral, or relational obligations that genuine spirituality naturally demands.
That's a heavy realization. We want the shortcut to peace. But this brings me to the most difficult human question we have to face in this whole discussion, and we can't avoid it. We've laid out this beautiful, perfect neurorestorative system.
Yeah.
We've talked about how Sala heals the brain. But reality on the ground is incredibly messy. There are devout, sincere people listening right now who pray their 5 daily prayers. They wake up in the middle of the night to pray. They cry in their prostration. And yet, they still suffer terribly from clinical depression, severe anxiety disorders, and crippling trauma.
It's a very painful reality.
If Sala is this ultimate perfect circuit breaker, why doesn't it cure everyone who practices it?
This is the most crucial part of our conversation, and it requires deep empathy and absolute clinical clarity. It is the agonizing conundrum of unanswered prayers and damaged circuitry. We have to understand that severe psychiatric conditions like major depressive disorder, severe PTSD, or bipolar disorder are not simply bad moods or spiritual weaknesses.
Right.
They involve actual physical damage to the biological hardware of the brain.
When you say physical damage, what do you mean? Like a concussion?
In cases of chronic severe depression or long-term trauma, you see profound structural changes. For example, you often see significant atrophy or shrinking of the hippocampus.
The hippocampus. What does that part do, and why does it shrink?
The hippocampus is vital for memory formation and emotion regulation. Under chronic stress, your body constantly pumps out cortisol, the stress hormone. In short bursts, cortisol saves your life. But when it's flooding your brain constantly for months or years, it becomes neurotoxic.
Neurotoxic, so it actually destroys tissue.
It literally poisons the cells in the hippocampus, causing the organ to physically shrink. At the same time, you see severe dysregulation of the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the system that controls how your body reacts to stress. The neurotransmitter systems involving serotonin and dopamine become biologically compromised. The receptors become blunted.
So going back to the stained glass window analogy, the glass isn't just dirty, it's shattered.
The glass is shattered. The biological hardware necessary to receive and process the spiritual signal is physically broken. In this state of severe illness, the brain's baseline capacity to achieve that calm, CEN dominant state of Kushu we talked about earlier is biologically blocked.
Oh, wow.
The vagus nerve loses its tone. The DMN cannot be suppressed by sheer willpower because the prefrontal cortex is exhausted and malnourished.
So what happens when someone in that state goes to their community for help and they are told that they just need to pray harder? Because that's the default advice in a lot of religious spaces. If you're depressed, your faith must be weak. Pray more.
That advice, while often well-intentioned, can be clinically disastrous. When a brain with physically damaged inhibitory circuitry tries to force absolute cognitive stillness, it often triggers what psychologists call an ironic rebound effect.
An ironic rebound effect. What does that look like in practice?
Imagine a person with severe trauma-induced anxiety standing in prayer. They are desperately trying to suppress their anxious, intrusive thoughts to achieve kushu. But because their error detection system is hyper-vigilant from trauma, the intense effort to suppress the thoughts actually forces their brain to constantly monitor itself for failure.
Oh, no. So they're thinking about thinking.
Exactly. Am I thinking an anxious thought? Yes, I am. I failed. This spikes their cortisol levels even higher and triggers a traumatic performance anxiety loop. The prayer mat, which is supposed to be a place of sanctuary and vagal safety, becomes a trigger for intense distress and guilt.
That is utterly heartbreaking. People feel like they are failing God, they feel entirely abandoned, when the reality is that their biology is just severely injured. How does the classical Islamic tradition actually handle this reality? Because surely they recognized mental illness.
The traditional Islamic framework handles this with immense compassion and pragmatism through the concept of asbab, which means the necessary utilization of material means. The Prophet Muhammad explicitly and repeatedly mandated seeking medical treatment.
He did.
Yes. He stated that God created a cure for every illness and commanded his followers to seek out those cures. He didn't say, just pray the sickness away. He said, treat yourselves.
So spiritual intervention does not and was never meant to replace medical intervention.
Never. That is a modern distortion. Salah is the overarching spiritual framework of a human life. It provides ultimate meaning, orientation, and connection. And for a healthy, functioning brain, it is an incredible preventative maintenance tool that builds resilience against the chaos of the world.
That it has limits.
But it is not a magic pill, and it does not replace the need for psychiatric or psychological intervention when the brain is biologically wounded. You use medicine, therapy, and community support to repair the hardware so that the software of prayer can run effectively again.
But what about the emotional experience? There's a very specific state that the classical mystics and scholars described. They called it spiritual desolation, or cabd.
A very well-known state.
It's described as the feeling of God's absolute absence. A total emotional numbness, a constriction of the chest, even when you are praying with utmost sincerity. I know people who feel this, and they agonize over it.
Yes, kabed is a heavily documented phenomenon in the spiritual literature. In modern clinical terms, it often perfectly corresponds to the anhedonia seen in clinical depression. Anhedonia is the complete inability to feel pleasure, reward, or emotional warmth.
So they just feel nothing.
When a person is experiencing this profound desolation, they feel absolutely no warmth, no peace, no kushu during their prayer. They feel like they are speaking into an empty void.
And they often feel intensely guilty about that numbness, right? They think God is rejecting them.
They do, but the Islamic theological framework offers a profound radical comfort here. The divine accounting system, as understood in the tradition, evaluates the difficulty of the effort, not just the emotional outcome. Missing the warm feeling of kushu because of clinical depression, biological burnout, or trauma is not a spiritual failure, it's a symptom of an illness.
So what are they supposed to do?
In fact, continuing to stand on the prayer mat, continuing to bow, continuing to lower your head to the ground, while feeling absolutely nothing, feeling only darkness and despair that requires a monumental, heroic act of will. It is a profound form of behavioral activation.
Yeah.
The classical masters taught something incredibly beautiful about this state. They taught that praying through the numbness, praying through the dark night of the soul, is often recorded as a far higher and more noble act of worship than praying while floating on a cloud of spiritual ecstasy.
Because it relies entirely on pure faith and raw obedience rather than the neurochemical reward of feeling good.
Exactly. When you feel the ecstasy of prayer, part of you is worshiping for the feeling. When you feel nothing but pain and you pray anyway, you are worshiping entirely for the Creator.
So prayer isn't a magic wand that fixes your brain chemistry overnight.
No. It is a brilliant, deeply engineered cognitive and spiritual architecture for human flourishing. It guides us, it shapes our attention, and it heals our baseline anxieties over the course of a lifetime. It pulls us out of the digital dopamine loops.
But we're still human.
But we are still profoundly embodied creatures. We are subject to biology, to illness, to grief, and to the absolute necessity of communal and medical support. The perfection of the prayer does not erase the fragility of the human being performing it.
That compassion, that nuanced understanding of our human frailty is just as important as all the cutting-edge neuroscience we've discussed today. We started this conversation by talking about the diagnostic muddy waters of the modern mind. We looked at how broken our attention is, how fractured our pieces become, and how the infinite scroll literally traps our neurology. And we've walked through the mechanics of how the ancient postures, the fixed visual gating, the rhythmic semantic recitation, and the physical surrender to gravity all work together to forcefully break that trap. It is a system engineered to literally rebuild our capacity to be present in a world designed to distract us.
And presence, true, unbroken presence, is the absolute foundation of a meaningful human life. If you are not present, you cannot love, you cannot learn, and you cannot connect.
You can't. And that leads me to a final thought I want to leave you with. We live in an attention economy. Every corporation, every app, every billboard is desperately trying to monetize your attention, to sell every single second of your conscious focus to the highest bidder. In a world like that, your attention is your most valuable asset. But there's a deeper philosophical layer here. If you cannot control what you look at, if you cannot control what your mind focuses on, do you actually possess free will? Or are you just a biological machine reacting to the loudest notification? The most radical, rebellious act a human being can do today isn't to argue online. It is to take that hijacked attention back, to rip it away from the screen, to step off the dopamine treadmill, and to give that attention freely, totally, and silently to their creator. Reclaiming your attention isn't just a life hack. It is the ultimate reclamation of your soul's autonomy. I want you listening to this to try something tangible today. The next time you stand in prayer, observe where your eyes go. Feel the physical weight of your own distraction breaking as you lower your head on the floor.
Experience the quiet, defiant biology of your own surrender. To rebuild your mental peace and legacy today, give charity, sponsor a student, and plant a tree. May Allah grant us success. Don't forget to come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.